Hi everyone! So I made this ice cream model a while ago and thought it could maybe be helpful to record a tutorial for you guys. If you want to see more tutorials like this, please let me know in the comments. So let's start. First I want to show you how I made the swirl. So for this, let's first add the NURBS curve. And now there's a couple of ways that we can add thickness to this. We could, for example, use those settings here and add another curve to control the shape. But for this tutorial, I want to use geometry nodes. And I'm a beginner at geometry nodes myself, so don't worry. This one's really easy. I really like to use geometry nodes here because it gives us much more control and is non-destructive. So we can still change the shape at the end and could create different looking swirls really easily. So let's go into the geometry nodes editor. And click new to create a new geometry node setup. Then first we want to add a curve to mesh node. You can do this with Shift A. And this node does what it says, it turns our curve into a mesh. But we also need to plug something into the curve profile here to tell it what we want our geometry to look like. So I'm going here with a star shape, but you could also add other shapes like a curved circle, for example. Then I set the points to 6, the inner radius to 0.16, the outer radius to 0.3, and the twist to -17.7. You can play around with those settings, that's just the ones that I liked. Then to round the corners we can add a fillet curve node. Set this to poly. And because we are working with such tiny numbers, it's a bit difficult to control the radius here. So we can do this little trick now, but this is optional. So add a math node and set this to divide and set the second value to 1000. Now we can plug this into our radius and now we can control the radius very easily here with this value slider. And that's how we can round our corners. I set my value to about 44 and I've also set the count here to 4. And yeah, can now play around with this until we are happy with it. And you can also come in here later when extruding your swirl and try out different looks. Now make sure to tick fill caps, so both of our ends are filled. Then add a set material node. Create a new material and select it here. And one important thing to note, if you maybe later want to change your material, you always have to come and change it here as well. I'll show you later. And yeah, that's already it for our geometry node setup. I have this method from Joey Carlino on YouTube. In his video he's going into much more detail about geometry nodes and also shows you more things you could add to your swirl setup. So I highly recommend watching his video if you want to learn more about it. Now that we are done with our geometry node setup, we want to go into edit mode and start extruding our swirl. And by the way, here in the item menu we can control the radius and the tilt of each point. So this is going to be really useful too. So now to extrude our swirl, we can just select one of the outer points and press E to extrude, and with G we can move the points around. It takes a little bit of practice and this process can be quite tedious. It took me a while to shape mine, so I'm gonna skip ahead here to my final swirl for the tutorial. And that's it. So now that we have this, we can make the cone. For this, I'm adding a cylinder and set this to 8. This depends on how many segments you want your cone to have. You could also, for example, set it to like 16. Now we can scale it and extrude it. So when extruding it, I'm making sure that it has edges where I later want the edges of the cone waffle to be. And to create the waffle look, I want to show you here two different approaches. So I'm going to duplicate this real quick. First, I want to show you the inset method. For this, let's first apply the scale. Then press I to inset the faces and make sure to select individual here. Then extrude them with E and press S to scale them inwards. Set shade smooth and add a subdivision surface modifier. Now add some supporting loops. And that's it for the first method. For this model I wanted to get a bit of a different waffle look though, so here's method 2. So first I'm adding 2 more loops here where I want the horizontal edges of the waffle to be. Then I select all of the vertical edges and press Ctrl B to bevel them. Then I select all of those edges and extrude them outwards with E and S and scale them down a bit along the Z-axis. Now also add a subdivision surface modifier and some supporting loops. And I was now making some more tweaks to my cone until I was happy with the result. Like this. And now that we have this, we can make the small napkin. For this you can just add the cylinder. I'm gonna use this part of the duplicated cone that I still have. And align it and scale it. And now if we want, we can add a little overlap. To do this, we can select this edge and press right click split edge. Now we can tweak the points a bit. And add a subdivision surface modifier, a solidify modifier and some supporting loops. And this is already our ice cream mesh. Now we can go into shading. So go to the shader editor and select the material we already created for the swirl. Here is my ice cream for reference. So first we want to create a basic toon shader setup. To do this, we first want to add a shader to RGB node and a color ramp. Set the color ramp to constant, and with the slider here you can now control the shadow and give it a color. We want to go to the render properties and make sure ambient occlusion is turned on. It's turned off by default, and if you don't turn it on, then the ambient occlusion node we're gonna use in a second will not work. This took me a lot of time to remember at the beginning of learning how to shade in Eevee, and then I would spend so much time trying to figure out why my scene was not working properly. So make sure you turn this on. And also go down to your color management settings and change the view transform from HEX to standard. I always do this when making an anime scene in Blender, then the colors look so much more vibrant and less muddy. Then let's add a mixed color node. Plug this into the B socket and change this to multiply. In the first socket you can now choose a color. This is our base color. So what we are doing here now is we are basically putting the shadow over our base color. So usually here is where I plug in all of my base color stuff. Sometimes it's a gradient, sometimes a noise texture. Just everything base color goes into here. Now for the swirl here, I'm gonna do it a little bit differently, and it's a bit of an exception. Because to create this soft ice look, we are going to add an ambient occlusion node in a bit of a special way. So that's why I'm choosing my base color a bit darker than usual. So let's add an ambient occlusion node. And the color ramp. Duplicate the mix node and set it to add. Plug it in and set the color ramp to constant. Now you can see the ambient occlusion node is very powerful, and we can make use of this to create a subtle color variation of the soft eyes. Now here you can play around with the distance. I set mine to 0.4. And now let's add some colors. I spent a lot of time playing around with it, trying to figure out what colors that I liked. Normally, and you can see this in a bit when we are shading the cone, I would use the ambient occlusion node with just one color and use it for what it's meant to be used for, to add ambient occlusion. But as I said, for the soft eyes look, this worked the best. Now something to keep in mind if you want to change your material. Let's say you want to try a different color, then you see it's not showing up. That's because, as I've already mentioned, you also need to change the material in the geometry nodes editor. And if you change it here now you can see it. It's a bit annoying, but I haven't found a workaround yet. So now for our cone, let's just use the swirl material, duplicate it and reset the color ramp. You can do this with backspace. Now set this to multiply, and this is how I usually set up my toon shader. I'm gonna adjust the color ramp in a bit, but just as a general overview. We have the shadow, the base color and the normal ambient occlusion. And then next we will add a highlight here. But first let's change the base color to a beige. Then set the color ramp to constant and adjust the slider. I also changed the color of it to a brownish tone. And by the way, here with this factor slider, we can control the strength of our ambient occlusion. And here, with this slider, we can control the strength of our shadow. Then next, let's add the highlight. For this, we want to duplicate the mix node and set it to add. Then add a glossy BSDF shader. And now, same as for our shadow, we want to add a shader to RGB node and a color ramp. Set this to constant as well, and with this slider you can now control the coverage of our highlight. And for this I'm plugging it into the factor so it acts like a mask basically. And then we can set the color here in the B socket. You could also do the exact same setup as we did for the shadow, but for the highlight I prefer to do it this way. And by the way, the shadow and the highlight are both reactive to the light. There's also ways we could add a fake shadow or a fake highlight, but I'm gonna cover that in a different tutorial. And yeah, that's how I set up my toon shader. And for the napkin, we can add the same shader. Just duplicate it and change the color. And we don't need a highlight here, so let's delete it. And now we are done with the shading. I also added outlines to my model, so I quickly want to show you how I made those. So here you can see what it's gonna look like with our outlines and here without. And by the way, I've also added a plane with a white emission shader as our background. So to add outlines, there's so many different methods. I'm gonna show you the line art modifier here. And by the way, for this to work, you need an active camera in your scene, because the way the line art modifier works, it creates the outlines from the camera view. So to add the line art, press Shift A and go to Grease Pencil, and here you can find the line art modifier. If we choose the scene line art here, it creates outlines for everything in our scene. But for this model I don't want that. I don't like those lines in the swirl, but I do like them for the cone. So to do this we can add two separate line art modifiers. So let's delete this one, and instead let's add an object line art. And select the swirl as our object. Now here you can change the thickness of it, and under edge types you can play around with the settings. I turned off everything and changed it from contour to individual silhouette. And this just gives us the outlines around the model. Then for the cone and the napkin, we can use a collection line art modifier. For this to work, we want to put the cone and the napkin into a collection and then select this collection here. Then here we can play around with the settings again. And I set my line thickness to 10. Now this is what our outline looks like so far, but it looks very harsh with the black color. So to change the color, we can go here, and I chose like this brown reddish tone for the swirl. If you want to use the same color for everything, you can just copy and paste the hex code. I chose two different colors. And yeah, this is our ice cream now. Now lastly, I want to quickly show you how I made the annotation scribbles. So for this, let's press Shift A and go to Grease Pencil and select blank. And I want to drag this out of my collection. Then here you can go into draw mode and just scribble on your canvas. And you can do this in 3D. I just sometimes like to write notes like that. It's really quick and looks so pretty. I usually make sure I'm either in orthographic mode or don't change my perspective while scribbling, so it stays on the same like plane. And you can change the draw size here and the strength of it too. I always set the strength to 1 and usually disable pen pressure. Oh, and one really important thing to note. Whenever you are adding a grease pencil object, it automatically creates a keyframe on the frame you are. So if your scribbles suddenly seem to disappear, don't panic, they are still there. It's probably just that keyframe. So make sure to drag the keyframe to the far left of your timeline and the problem is solved. And yeah, this is it for the tutorial. And I hope this tutorial was helpful. Please let me know in the comments what you think. And if you would like to support me, please consider leaving a like and a subscription to the channel. And I also have a Patreon now. I upload my project files there, and there are also some written PDF tutorials. Basically everything I sell on my Gumroad is also gonna be on my Patreon. So if you want to learn more about how to create anime style stuff in Blender, I highly recommend checking it out. And yeah, I also have a lot of other tutorials planned already, and I think the next one is gonna be the lemon slice, and this should hopefully drop at the end of this week. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you liked it.